She was considered a common offender and handcuffed right at the shooting range. But when the Admiral entered the hall with secret documents, everyone realized who she really was. Subscribe and write in the comments which country you're watching this video from. Dawn broke over the cracked concrete and rusting chain-link fences that surrounded the old shooting range on the outskirts of Atlanta. Mist hung low across the scrubby grass and trash-littered ditches, weaving around the faded lines of parking spaces and the crooked wooden sign that creaked in the soft wind. Trucks rumbled past on the distant highway, and the scent of diesel mingled with wet earth, coffee, and old oil that seeped from the ground beneath the battered shooting lanes. Inside the small, dimly lit office that overlooked the range, Walter leaned against the counter with a mug of cheap coffee steaming in his hand. His hair was steel gray, cropped close to his head, his shoulders still broad despite the years that weighed on him like invisible iron. For 15 years, since retiring from the Army, he had opened this range before sunrise, unlocking the warped door to the supply shed, sweeping spent casings off the concrete, and nodding to the early risers who came to practice before work. Hunters in flannel shirts, off-duty officers with tired eyes, and veterans like him looking for a place to keep their hands steady. That morning, as the horizon turned from gray to pale gold, a battered pickup pulled into the lot, its headlights slicing through the mist before flicking off. The door opened, and a woman stepped down, closing it with a soft thud that barely stirred the air. She wore faded jeans, boots dulled by dust and time, and a plain gray jacket zipped up to the neck. A dark baseball cap shadowed her face, and her skin was the deep, warm brown of someone who spent time in the sun, though there was nothing casual about the way she moved. Balanced, controlled, as if each step was measured not for speed but for quiet efficiency. In her hand, she carried a long, scuffed case that could have held a musician's instrument or a tradesman's tools, but Walter knew better. She paused near the door, glanced once around the lot, eyes flicking from the overgrown tree line to the cracked road and the empty horizon beyond, then stepped inside to pay for the lane farthest from the others. She never spoke more than necessary, her voice quiet, flat, and firm as she handed over cash, her fingers calloused and clean. Walter noticed the way her eyes swept over the room without appearing to look, noting the exits, the angles, the positions of the security cameras that blinked lazily in the corners of the ceiling. It was the kind of scan he had seen in war zones and border towns, the kind that told him she was measuring risks, assessing threats, even here in this nowhere place. Outside, she moved to the farthest lane, the one that overlooked the wide stretch of field beyond the marked distances. She set the case down gently, kneeling beside it as she unlatched it with slow, deliberate movements. Inside was a rifle, not the high-polished kind of weekend enthusiasts, but something worn, matte black with subtle modifications that spoke of precision and necessity rather than hobby. She checked it piece by piece, her hands moving with the easy fluidity of muscle memory, every motion quiet, unhurried, exact. She stood and stretched once, rolling her shoulders back, turning her neck in a slow arc as if to release the tension gathered there. Then she loaded the rifle, adjusting the sling across her chest before she lifted it to her shoulder and took her stance. The mist was thinning now, and the sun was a pale disk climbing above the trees, catching on the dewdrops that clung to the battered targets scattered across the range. Walter leaned against the post, sipping his coffee, watching her through the dirty window of the office. He could tell by the way she inhaled, slow and steady, holding her breath just long enough before letting it go in a silent rhythm, that she was trained. the kind of trained that didn't come from a weekend course or a few years in the reserves. This was the kind of train that was etched into a person's bones, that lived in the small adjustments of their shoulders, in the precise stillness before a shot. The rifle barked softly, the report sharp in the cool air, and Walter's eyes tracked the distant target where the paper flapped once, twice, and then stilled with a neat hole dead center. She didn't adjust the scope, didn't shift her feet, but moved to the next target, further out, with the same quiet breath, the same calm exhale, and fired again. Another center hit, impossibly precise at that range without recalibrating, without electronic aids, just the instinct and calculation of someone who read the wind in the sway of branches and the scent of the air. Others on the range began to notice, their conversations pausing as they watched the dark-skinned woman in the gray jacket hitting impossible shots without hesitation. She didn't look back, didn't acknowledge the growing attention, simply reloaded, fired, and recorded each result in a small, worn notebook she kept on the bench beside her. Walter saw the notebook as she flipped it open between shots, the pages covered in small, neat handwriting. But these were not the notes of an enthusiast tracking groupings for sport. He caught glimpses of coordinates, wind speeds, humidity percentages, and quick angular diagrams that only made sense to someone who calculated distances in real-world variables, not just on paper. As the morning turned, a breeze picked up, lifting the edges of the targets, carrying with it the sharp smell of gunpowder and dew. The woman adjusted her stance slightly, turning her body into the wind, eyes narrowing just a fraction as she inhaled, held, and exhaled. Another shot, another impossible hit. A small group of men down the line stopped entirely now, watching in a silence that felt heavier than the crisp air. Walter set down his cup, stepping outside to watch more closely. He saw her eyes shift once, scanning the lot again, the roads, the sky. It was not paranoia. It was awareness, a constant, unbroken thread of vigilance that ran through her even as she seemed at peace. Inside, Walter's mind worked, fitting together the pieces. The controlled breathing, the impossibly steady hands, the way she recorded data that most wouldn't notice, let alone track. She was someone trained to see what others missed, to operate without being seen, to move through spaces like this one without drawing attention, and yet here she was, drawing it anyway because her skill was undeniable. In the quiet moments between shots, she would pause, her eyes distant, as if listening to something only she could hear. Perhaps the echo of old commands, the memory of missions that had ended on nights darker than this dawn, the knowledge of responsibilities she could not leave behind. There was something about the way she exhaled after each shot that spoke of weight carried alone. Just before noon, as the day warmed and the mist finally burned away, a black and white patrol car pulled into the lot, the gravel crunching under its tires. Two uniformed officers stepped out, hands resting near their belts, eyes already locked on the woman at the far end of the range. One of them, a young man with a rigid posture, said something to his partner, who nodded, looking uneasy. They approached slowly, boots scraping the gravel, the young officer calling out to her with a firm but cautious voice, asking for identification, for a permit for the weapons she held with such calm familiarity. She lowered the rifle, her hands open and empty as she turned to face them, her expression unreadable beneath the shadow of her cap. Walter watched from the doorway, tension tightening in his chest. He saw the way her eyes moved, once more scanning everything around her, the angles of the parked cars, the position of the officers, the roads leading away, the tree line beyond. She said something he couldn't hear, too quiet, too level, and the officers exchanged a glance before repeating their demand. She reached into her pocket, pulling out the old, unmarked keycard and the worn notebook, handing them over without resistance. There was no ID, no phone, nothing else. The younger officer looked at his partner, uncertain, and Walter saw the moment the decision was made. The handcuffs came out, the steel glinting in the sunlight as they approached. The woman offered her wrists calmly, allowing them to snap the cuffs around her without a word, her eyes watching them with that same unflinching steadiness. Walter saw the faint lines of tension in her arms, the way her breath changed for a moment before she steadied it again. She did not resist, did not argue, did not plead. She simply complied, silent and focused, as if this too was part of some plan only she understood. They led her across the range, past the staring eyes of other shooters, toward the patrol car. The gravel crunched under their boots, the cuffs clicked with each step, and the sun glinted off the glass of the office where Walter stood, watching. Her eyes, dark and sharp, flickered over him for a brief second, and in that glance he saw something that made him shiver, a calculation, an acknowledgement, a message that passed between them without words. As the patrol car drove away, dust rising behind it, Walter stood alone, the smell of spent gunpowder hanging in the warming air. He looked down the empty lane where she had stood, the targets riddled with impossible patterns of precision. The notebook, the unmarked card, the quiet intensity in her eyes. He knew then that she was not what she seemed, that her presence here was not a coincidence. Some shadows move among us with purpose, he thought, as he turned back into the office, closing the door behind him. And some mornings you realize the world is larger and far more dangerous than it appears from behind a counter with a cup of coffee in your hand. And in that silence the range stood empty again, waiting for the next sunrise and for the return of the shadow that had come, leaving only the echo of her shots in the air and the quiet certainty that nothing about this morning was ordinary. The holding cell was small, its air heavy with the mingled scents of disinfectant, stale coffee, and the faint copper tang of metal. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting pale shadows that seemed to stretch and shiver across the cement floor. Outside the barred window, dawn had long since given way to the bright, indifferent light of late morning, the sounds of traffic and distant sirens drifting in to remind the room that life continued elsewhere. Naomi Hadson sat on the edge of the narrow bench attached to the wall, her back straight, hands resting on her knees, fingers loosely interlaced. She wore the same plain gray jacket, though they had taken her cap, and her dark hair, twisted into a tight braid, fell over her shoulder like a quiet statement of control in a place built to strip it away. The handcuffs were gone now, replaced by the locked door and the unspoken expectation that she would wait, would break, would reveal herself. She did not. In the small observation room adjacent to the holding cells, 2 officers watched her through the glass, the younger of the 2 shifting from foot to foot, uneasy, while the older man, Detective Carter, stood with arms folded, eyes narrowed in thought. The woman in the cell had been silent since her arrival. She had complied with the booking procedures without protest, standing as they took her photograph, turning her hands over for fingerprints, emptying her pockets to reveal only a single worn notebook and a keycard with no markings. They had asked her name. She had given none. They had asked where she lived, what she was doing at the range, why she had no identification, no phone, no wallet, nothing to prove who she was or why she was there, firing rounds with a skill that none of them could explain. She had remained silent, her gaze steady, unblinking, watching each officer with the same quiet composure, the same impenetrable calm that was beginning to unsettle even Carter, a man who had spent 2 decades reading the faces of liars, of the desperate, of the guilty and the broken. Her silence was not the silence of fear or defiance. It was the silence of someone who had measured this moment long before it arrived. They had run her prints through local databases, state, federal, even military, but nothing came back. Her fingerprints were as clean as a ghost, no record, no past, no trace. The notebook was filled with lines of neat, meticulous handwriting that seemed to list weather patterns, coordinates, distances, wind speeds, and small diagrams that none of the officers could decipher. The keycard was blank, and the scanners they used to read it returned nothing but errors. Detective Carter watched her through the glass as she sat unmoving, her breathing slow and even, as if she were somewhere else entirely, far removed from the cold concrete and steel around her. In her stillness there was a tension, a readiness that spoke of purpose, and it was that purpose Carter could not read, could not understand, and it made him uneasy in a way few things ever had. The younger officer spoke, his voice low, uncertain, asking what they should do next, suggesting they call the FBI, Homeland Security, someone who could take her off their hands before this turned into something they were unprepared to handle. Carter did not respond immediately, his eyes still on the woman, watching the way she blinked only occasionally, how her gaze moved slowly around the cell, noting the camera in the corner, the hinges on the door, the vents high in the walls. It was the gaze of someone who had seen the inside of cells before, who had measured them not as places of confinement but as puzzles to be solved, routes to be mapped, weaknesses to be found. He turned away finally, telling the young officer to bring her water, to see if she would speak, to see if even a gesture of kindness would draw her out. The young man hesitated, then left, the door closing softly behind him, leaving Carter alone with the restless hum of the lights and the weight of unspoken questions. In the cell, Naomi accepted the cup of water without a word, her fingers brushing the young officer's hand. Light, almost incidental, but her eyes met his for the briefest of moments, and something in that gaze made him flinch, though he could not have said why. She sipped the water, set the cup down on the floor beside her, and returned to her silent vigil, her breathing steady, her posture unbroken. Hours passed. The sun moved across the sky, shadows lengthening and shifting across the cell, across the observation room where Carter stood reviewing her file, blank as it was, again and again, looking for something he had missed. The air grew stale, the silence heavier, and the station outside the holding cells moved with the usual rhythms of calls and paperwork, the chatter of officers, the hum of printers, the occasional laughter that felt out of place near the cold quiet of the woman in the cell. Carter finally entered the cell with a chair, placing it opposite her, sitting down heavily, his knees cracking softly, his eyes on her face as he leaned forward, elbows on his thighs, hands clasped. He spoke to her then, not as an interrogator, but as a man who had seen too much, who had grown tired of guessing. He told her what they had found, or rather what they had not found, how there was no record of her existence, how the weapon she had used was unregistered, how the charges she faced could lead to serious consequences, how he wanted to help her, but could not if she would not help herself. She did not respond, did not move, did not even blink in the bright light that buzzed above them. Her eyes stayed on his, dark and deep, reflecting nothing back, giving him nothing, and yet somehow not dismissing him either. It was as if she were waiting, allowing him to speak, to exhaust himself, to fill the silence so that she would not have to. Outside the cell, officers moved quietly, watching through the glass as Carter spoke and she listened, the stillness between them growing thicker with each passing minute. At last, Carter stood, the scrape of the chair loud in the small space, and left without looking back, the door closing with a soft thud that echoed in the silence she left behind. Night fell, the lights dimming in the station, replaced by the blue glow of security lights that cast long shadows down the corridors. In her cell, Naomi lay down on the bench, her braid a dark line against the concrete, her eyes closing, but her breathing remained measured, controlled, as she listened to the sounds of the building around her, the footsteps of the night shift, the hum of the vending machine, the distant bark of a dog outside, the rhythmic click of the clock on the wall of the observation room. In the darkness, she opened her eyes, staring up at the ceiling, watching the faint shadows move, and she remembered. She remembered the soft rustle of leaves in distant countries, the way the dust rose under the downdraft of helicopters, the smell of sweat and sand and oil, the weight of the rifle in her hands, the sound of her own breathing as she watched through scopes in the dark, waiting, always waiting, for the moment when action would replace silence. She remembered faces, voices, the quick, precise orders given over comms, the quiet moments before dawn in places where dawn came like a promise and a threat. She remembered names, some of which she could no longer speak, some of which she tried to forget, and she remembered the reason she was here, in this cell, in this small corner of a city that did not know her, that could not know her. She closed her eyes again, her breathing slow, even, measured. The mission was not yet complete. In the observation room, Carter watched her on the monitor, her stillness unsettling him even now. He had seen criminals beg, rage, cry, break down in the silence of these cells, but she did none of these things. She was waiting, and he felt deep in his bones that whatever she was waiting for was something far larger than the charges they had listed on the paperwork in her file. Outside, the city moved through the night, unaware of the shadow that had passed through their streets, of the woman who waited in silence, her mind working quietly behind calm eyes, calculating, remembering, preparing. And as the darkness deepened, as the hum of the lights and the quiet breathing of the station settled into the rhythm of midnight, Naomi Hadson lay in her cell, her hands folded across her chest, her breathing steady, her eyes closed, but her mind wide awake, waiting for dawn, for the next moment, for the signal she knew would come, because the mission was not yet complete, and she would not speak until it was. The courthouse was a monument to a different era, its brick walls darkened by time and weather, its wooden benches worn smooth by generations of restless hands and shifting bodies. The morning light filtered through tall, grimy windows, illuminating the dust motes that drifted lazily in the air as the room filled with low murmurs and the shuffle of feet. Outside, the city of Atlanta hummed with the indifferent busyness of another weekday, but inside the courtroom the tension was a living thing, coiling in the hush before the proceedings began. Naomi Hadson was led into the courtroom in chains, the orange jumpsuit stark against her dark skin, the clink of the cuffs echoing as she moved with the same measured calm that had unsettled the officers who brought her here. Her eyes remained, forward, unblinking, taking in everything without appearing to look, the bailiffs on either side of her, the rows of curious onlookers, the small knot of local reporters clutching notebooks and cameras, the heavy wooden bench where the judge would soon sit. She was guided to the defendant's table, where a tired public defender sat with papers stacked before him, his suit rumpled, his eyes shadowed by the weight of too many cases and too little time. He glanced up at her as she sat down, opening his mouth to speak, but the words died on his lips as he met her gaze, the quiet steadiness in her eyes silencing any attempt at small talk or reassurance. Across the aisle, Detective Carter sat in the front row, a folder on his lap, his fingers drumming lightly on the cover as he watched the woman he had brought here. He felt the eyes of the press on him, knew they were whispering about the arrest, about the mysterious woman who had appeared at a shooting range and refused to say who she was, about the unregistered weapon, the charges of potential domestic terrorism, the rumors of something bigger beneath the surface. The judge entered, the room rising as one before settling again, the heavy robes sweeping around her as she took her seat, her face set in a mask of irritation and fatigue. She glanced at the docket, flipping through the papers with a practiced efficiency, pausing only briefly as she came to Naomi's file, her eyebrows knitting as she read the notes, the words "refusal to identify" and "potential threat" underlined in thick black ink. The prosecutor rose, clearing his throat, his voice filling the room as he began to list the charges against Naomi. Illegal possession of a firearm, refusal to identify herself to law enforcement, suspicion of activities that could be linked to terrorism. His words were sharp, precise, carrying the authority of the state. But as he spoke, Naomi sat unmoving, her hands folded on the table, her eyes focused ahead, the lines of her face calm, unyielding. The public defender shifted beside her, clearing his throat, standing to request a continuance, citing the lack of cooperation from his client, the need for more time to prepare a defense. The judge frowned, tapping her pen against the desk, her eyes flicking from the defender to Naomi and back again, weighing the request, the frustration clear in the set of her jaw. Before she could respond, the doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a suddenness that silenced the room, the heavy wood creaking as they parted. Heads turned, the reporters leaning forward, pens poised, as two uniformed officers entered, flanking a man in a dark blue dress uniform adorned with ribbons and medals that caught the light in sharp, colorful flashes. His face was lined, his hair cut close and silvered at the temples, his eyes sharp and clear as he moved down the aisle with measured, silent steps. Behind him, two men in dark suits followed, their expressions unreadable, their movements precise, the weight of their presence shifting the air in the room. The veterans in the gallery, the older men wearing caps adorned with service pins, straightened instinctively, their backs stiffening in unconscious respect as the man in uniform approached the bench. The judge's eyes widened slightly, the irritation draining from her face as she recognized the insignia, the authority that walked toward her. The man handed a sealed envelope to the bailiff, who delivered it to the judge with careful hands. The paper crinkled softly as the seal was broken, the judge unfolding the document, her eyes scanning the words, her expression shifting from confusion to surprise, then to a deep, quiet understanding. The silence in the room deepened, pressing against the walls as the judge folded the document and looked up, her eyes moving to Naomi, then to the man in uniform and back again. "In light of the documentation provided by the Department of Defense," she said, her voice steady, though softer than before, "all charges against the defendant are dismissed, effective immediately. This case is now classified as a matter of national security." The gavel struck the wood, sharp and final, the sound like a shot in the stillness of the courtroom. A wave of confusion swept through the room, the reporters whispering urgently to each other, the onlookers turning to one another with wide eyes. But in the center of it all, Naomi remained as she had been, her posture perfect, her breathing steady, the calm in her eyes unbroken. The bailiff moved to her side, unlocking the cuffs with quick, fumbling hands, stepping back as the chains fell away. Naomi stood, straightening slowly, rolling her shoulders back, her chin lifting as she met the gaze of the man in uniform. For the first time, she spoke, her voice low, clear, carrying across the room with quiet authority. "Sir, I apologize for the inconvenience." The man in uniform, the Admiral, smiled faintly, shaking his head. "On the contrary, Commander Hadson," he replied, his voice warm, respectful, carrying the weight of familiarity and trust. "The Navy apologizes to you." At the word "Commander," the room shifted again, the veterans standing a little straighter, the officers in the gallery snapping to attention, even the judge rising from her seat in unconscious respect, her hand brushing against the edge of her robes as she nodded once toward Naomi. Carter watched, his heart thudding in his chest as the pieces fell into place, the silence in the cell, the calm under questioning, the impossible precision at the range, the quiet watchfulness that had unsettled him so deeply. She was not a suspect. She was not a criminal. She was something else entirely, something larger than the small space of their city, something vital that moved unseen to keep the world steady. Naomi nodded once to the Admiral, then turned to the judge, inclining her head in gratitude, her braid falling over her shoulder, the simple gesture carrying a weight that words could not. "Thank you for your understanding, Your Honor," the Admiral said, his voice soft as he turned to lead Naomi from the courtroom, the two men in suits falling in behind them. Outside, the flash of cameras greeted them, reporters shouting questions that went unanswered as Naomi moved through the crowd with the same calm grace, the Admiral shielding her from the press as they reached the waiting black SUV parked at the curb, the door opening as she paused, turning her head for a brief moment to look back at the courthouse, her eyes meeting Carter's across the distance. In that look, there was no anger, no resentment, only a quiet acknowledgement, a nod to the role he had played, the part he had unknowingly performed in something far larger than either of them. Then she stepped into the vehicle, the door closing behind her with a soft, final click, the engine rumbling to life as the SUV pulled away from the curb, merging into the traffic that flowed around it, disappearing into the city as if it had never been there. Carter stood on the steps, the folder still in his hand, the warm breeze tugging at the edges of the papers as he watched the vehicle vanish, the sounds of the city rising around him once more. Behind him, the courthouse doors closed, the reporters moving to file their stories, the judge returning to the docket, the moment passing as quickly as it had arrived, leaving only the quiet certainty that nothing had been what it seemed, that the woman they had called a suspect had been something else entirely, something necessary, something unseen, something that moved among them, protecting them, even as they failed to understand. As Carter turned to leave, the folder still in his hand, he felt the weight of that understanding settle in his chest, heavy but right, the certainty that the world was wider, more fragile, and more fiercely guarded than most would ever know. And somewhere in the city, Naomi Hadson, commander, operative, shadow, and protector, moved toward the next dawn, her mission unfinished, her purpose undimmed, the silence around her not a prison, but a promise. The dawn came quietly over Atlanta, painting the cracked sidewalks and aging rooftops in a soft, clean light that belied the weight of what had passed and what was yet to come. On the outskirts of the city, the shooting range stood silent in the early morning, the dew clinging to the battered targets, the air cool and still as if holding its breath. Walter arrived before the sun fully cleared the horizon, as he always did, unlocking the doors, sweeping the concrete, counting the boxes of ammunition stacked behind the counter. It was a ritual that grounded him, that reminded him of who he was after the uniform came off, of the steady simplicity of a place where people came to find their focus, to test themselves against the quiet challenges of distance and discipline. But that morning was different. She returned as quietly as she had come the first time, the battered pickup pulling into the lot, the engine shutting off with a soft sigh. Naomi Hadson stepped out, her boots crunching on the gravel, the braid over her shoulder, the gray jacket replaced by a simple black one. Clean but unremarkable, her dark eyes scanning the lot, the trees, the sky. She carried the same scuffed case, setting it down on the same bench, opening it with the same deliberate care, each motion precise, practiced, silent. Walter watched from the office door, a cup of coffee cooling in his hand, his eyes tracking her movements, the way she glanced at him once, a nod passing between them, acknowledgement without words. She set up at the farthest lane again, assembling the rifle, checking the parts, the scope, the weight of it in her hands. The dawn light caught on the edges of the barrel, on the small scuffs that spoke of real use, of places far from here, of nights spent waiting in the dark, listening for the breath of danger. She began to fire, the shots echoing across the empty range, sharp but somehow softer in the cool morning air. Each shot was measured, each breath controlled, each target struck with the same impossible precision that had first drawn Walter's attention. She made no effort to hide her skill now, no effort to blend into the background, her movements open, confident, the shadow of the woman who had once hidden herself replaced by the clear, undeniable presence of who she truly was. Walter watched her, remembering the day the patrol cars had come, the way she had let them cuff her, her eyes always scanning, always calculating. He remembered the day she had been led away in chains, the rumors that had spread, the whispers of who she might be. And he remembered the day she returned, the black SUV, the uniforms, the Admiral with his quiet authority, the way the reporters had pressed forward, shouting questions that were never answered. Now she was here again, the dawn light turning to morning, the shots ringing out across the range, the paper targets fluttering in the soft breeze before falling still, each one marked by the clean, precise holes of her passage. It was later that the others came, arriving in unmarked vehicles that parked quietly at the edge of the lot. Men and women stepped out dressed in plain clothes, but with the same way of moving, the same quiet, watchful energy that Naomi carried. They spoke little, nodding to Walter, carrying cases and equipment into the small office, transforming the range without spectacle into something else, something more. Walter watched as cables were unspooled, as maps were laid out on the scarred wooden tables, as radios were tested and retested, as laptops blinked to life with quiet urgency. The range became a staging point, a place of quiet coordination, the lanes beyond the office serving as cover for quiet conversations, for the practice that was more than practice, for the readiness that lived beneath the calm. Naomi moved among them, checking equipment, giving brief nods, receiving reports with a calm that never wavered. Her eyes were sharp, clear, alive with purpose, scanning the maps, the screens, the horizon beyond the trees. She paused occasionally, looking out at the targets downrange, her mind moving through calculations, possibilities, risks. Walter knew better than to ask questions, to press for details that would never be given. He saw the tension in the shoulders of the men who came with her, the way they glanced at the roads, at the sky, the way they carried themselves with the quiet certainty of those who had seen too much to believe in safety. Later, Detective Carter arrived, parking his unmarked sedan beside the trucks, stepping out with that same careful caution he had the first day he met her. He carried a folder under his arm, his badge clipped to his belt, his eyes scanning the scene with the practiced watchfulness of a man who understood that what he saw was only a fraction of what was happening. He met Walter's eyes, a nod passing between them, then turned to Naomi, who stood by the table, the maps spread before her, the screens glowing with satellite images, live feeds, coded transmissions. She greeted him with a nod, nothing more, but it was enough. They spoke quietly, moving over the maps, discussing locations, times, the thin lines of intelligence that had led them here. Walter could not hear the words, but he saw the way Carter's face tightened, the way Naomi's hand moved across the map, tapping points with a precise certainty. He knew enough to understand that something was coming, that something had been found, that the quiet of this place was the surface above deeper waters that moved unseen. As the day turned to evening, the air cooling again, the light shifting from gold to gray, Naomi moved to the lane once more, lifting the rifle, sighting downrange, the movement smooth, unhurried. She fired, the sound sharp, the target distant, the shot perfect. Behind her, the preparations continued. The quiet murmur of voices, the rustle of papers, the soft clicks of equipment being checked and rechecked. Carter moved among them, speaking quietly to the men and women who carried themselves with the same silent purpose, his posture that of a man who had accepted something he could not fully understand, but knew was necessary. That night, as darkness settled over the range, Walter locked the gates, moving through the quiet lanes, collecting the spent casings, resetting the targets, the familiar work grounding him as it always did. But, as he moved, he felt the presence of what had happened, of what was happening still, the weight of the silent watch that these people carried, the understanding that this place had become something more than a range. Inside, the office was alive with quiet activity, the screens glowing softly, the radios whispering coded messages, the maps marked with lines and circles that meant nothing to him, but everything to them. Naomi stood by the window, looking out into the darkness, her eyes reflecting the faint light from the screens, her silhouette steady, calm, ready. She was not hiding anymore. She was here because it mattered, because the mission was not yet complete, because there were threats that moved in the dark, and it was her purpose to meet them there, to hold the line that others did not even see. And as Walter watched her, he understood that some shadows were not to be feared, but to be honored, that some silence was not emptiness, but vigilance, that some people moved unseen not because they were hiding, but because they were guarding. As the night deepened, Naomi turned from the window, nodding once to him as she passed, moving back into the room where the others waited, where the quiet voices spoke of places and times and risks, where the preparations continued for what was to come. And outside, beyond the fences and the trees, the city lay quiet, unaware of the shadows that watched, of the guardians who moved unseen, of the woman who had returned to the range, not to hide, but to prepare, to protect, to finish what she had begun, because the mission was not yet complete, and she would see it through. If you found this story powerful, make sure to subscribe for more true stories of quiet heroes. Check out the next video to discover another story that will change the way you see the world. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, share this video with them.